What if I told you that Ferrari's real problem in Australia was not the car, but rather that Lewis Hamilton discovered something in the data that not even Maranello's own engineers had seen coming? Because although the final result of the Australian Grand Prix did not reflect clear dominance by Ferrari, something happened within the team that completely changed the perception of the SF26. When engineers began analyzing the telemetry after the race, they found patterns in Hamilton's driving that were not only different from Charles Leclerc's, but revealed a completely new way to exploit the car. At various points during the lap, the Briton was using less steering angle, rotating the car earlier and accelerating more cleanly on corner exit, which generated better minimum speeds and more efficient traction without punishing the tires. And the most surprising thing was not an isolated lap or a specific moment of the weekend. This behavior appeared repeatedly from free practice to qualifying, something that led Ferrari engineers to realize that Hamilton might have found a window of SF26 performance that the team had not yet managed to fully unlock. In fact, within Maranello, some began to suspect that the style of the seven-time world champion fits almost perfectly with the aerodynamic philosophy of the car, which would explain why the data he left in Australia has generated so much surprise within the team. What seemed like just a complicated debut ended up revealing something much bigger. The Ferrari might have more potential than everyone thought, and Hamilton might be the first to have figured out how to bring it out. The Australian Grand Prix left a public image quite clear for most fans. Ferrari had had a difficult weekend, far from the performance that many expected in Lewis Hamilton's debut with the Italian team. Qualifying was not particularly brilliant. The race did not allow for a fight for the front positions, and the final result seemed to confirm the feeling that the team still had a lot of work ahead of them. However, inside the Maranello garage, the story was completely different. While from the outside there was talk of a discreet debut, Ferrari engineers began to find something much more interesting when they reviewed the data of car number 44. What appeared in the telemetry not only attracted attention, but opened a very deep technical discussion within the team about the true potential of the SF26. The key to everything was in something that normally goes unnoticed by the public: the way in which a driver interprets the behavior of the car corner by corner. When engineers compared Hamilton's laps with those of Charles Leclerc, they discovered that the Briton was using the Ferrari in a different way. It wasn't about going more aggressive or just braking later. It was a much more subtle difference and, at the same time, much more revealing. Hamilton was rotating the car earlier on corner entry, using less steering angle and relying more on the stability of the rear axle to prepare for exit. This type of driving generated a very interesting effect in the data. The car maintained a higher minimum speed at the apex of the curves and at the same time accelerated earlier without causing excessive slippage in the rear wheels. For a Formula One engineer, this type of pattern is extremely valuable because it reveals something fundamental about the car. When a driver can rotate the car earlier without losing stability, it means that the aerodynamic and mechanical balance of the car is working in a very specific way. In the case of the SF26, everything pointed to the car having a wider performance window than Ferrari initially thought, but it only opened completely when the driver used a very specific way of attacking corners. And that's where Hamilton started to raise eyebrows within the team, because he seemed to have found that form almost naturally during his first full weekend of competition with Ferrari. And that is precisely why the Australian Grand Prix could end up being much more important than it seems in the championship standings. Not because of the points that Ferrari scored that weekend, but because of something much more valuable for any Formula One team: information. Because in a sport where every thousandth counts, discovering a new way to exploit your own car can completely change the course of a season. After the initial analysis of the weekend in Melbourne, Ferrari began a much deeper process than simply reviewing lap times or comparing results between drivers. Engineers dove into something much more detailed: the complete telemetry of the SF26 throughout the Australian Grand Prix. Each braking point, each acceleration phase, and each steering wheel movement were analyzed with millimeter precision. And that was when the real reason for surprise appeared within Maranello. The data showed that Lewis Hamilton was not only driving the car in a different way, but that he was accessing an area of the car's performance that the team had not yet managed to exploit consistently. In Formula One, there is a fundamental concept that engineers call the operating window. Each car has a very specific range in which everything works optimally. The aerodynamics produce the right load, the tires work at their ideal temperature, and the balance between the front and rear axle allows the driver to attack the corners with confidence. Outside of that window, the car may still be fast, but it never reaches its true potential. What the Australian data began to reveal is that Hamilton seemed to be finding that window at more points in the lap than any other driver who had driven the SF26 up to that point. One of the aspects that most puzzled the engineers was the way in which Hamilton managed the transition phase between braking and turning. Normally, in cars of this generation, this phase is extremely delicate because the weight of the car moves towards the front axle and any imbalance can cause loss of stability in the rear. However, something different appeared in the British data. Hamilton progressively released the brake while beginning to turn the car before other drivers, allowing the car to rotate more naturally without the need to apply sudden corrections with the steering wheel. That small difference had a knock-on effect on the rest of the corner. The car lined up earlier for the exit and could apply power more smoothly. When engineers overlaid Hamilton's laps with Charles Leclerc's on the telemetry graphs, the differences became even more apparent. In several sectors of the Albert Park circuit, Hamilton maintained a slightly higher minimum speed at the apex of the corners, but what was really important was what happened immediately afterwards. While other drivers needed to correct the car or wait a fraction of a second longer to accelerate safely, Hamilton was already applying power with the car perfectly oriented towards the next straight. This generated a more efficient acceleration and, consequently, a constant gain in time that was not always evident to the naked eye during the television broadcast. An idea even began to emerge within the team that until recently seemed too optimistic. Over the winter, some internal analysis had suggested that the SF26 could offer additional performance margin if the right way to balance corner entry with exit traction could be found. That margin, in certain conditions, could be up to half a second per lap compared to less efficient car settings. Until the Australian Grand Prix, that hypothesis remained more of a theoretical projection than a reality demonstrated on the track. But the data generated by Hamilton began to get dangerously close to those scenarios that Ferrari had only seen in simulation. Therefore, when Ferrari left Australia, the team's internal feeling was not simply that of having missed an opportunity on the track. It was the feeling of having discovered a very important clue about the true nature of his car. And in modern Formula One, where differences between teams can be decided by mere tenths of a second, that kind of information can be worth as much as a major aerodynamic upgrade. After everything that happened at the Australian Grand Prix, there is a conclusion that is beginning to gain strength within Ferrari, and that could be much more important than the result of the race itself. While the paddock was analyzing final positions, strategic errors, or the team's overall performance, in Maranello the engineers were looking at something very different: the data left by Lewis Hamilton in his first full big weekend with the SF26. And what they found in that telemetry was not simply a difference in style between drivers, but a possible key to understanding the car's true potential. Because if anything has become clear after the team's internal analysis, it is that the Ferrari could have a much wider performance window than initially thought. The behavior that Hamilton showed in various phases of the corners by rotating the car earlier, maintaining a higher minimum speed and accelerating with greater stability fits with a design philosophy that Ferrari had developed during the winter, but that had not yet been seen so clearly on the track. In other words, the car always had that potential, but it needed someone to figure out exactly how to unlock it. And that is what has generated so much expectation within the team. Because if Hamilton has been able to get close to that performance window in just his first Grand Prix with Ferrari, the question that many engineers in Maranello are now asking is inevitable. What can happen when the Briton understands the car 100% and the team begins to develop the SF26 around those sensations that are already appearing in the data? Formula One is full of moments that seem insignificant at the moment, but as the races go by they end up setting the course for an entire season. Sometimes it's not a spectacular victory or a historic pole position, but something much quieter: discovering a technical track that changes the way a team understands its own car. And at Ferrari there is a feeling that the Australian Grand Prix could have been precisely one of those moments. Because behind a discrete result was something that could be much more valuable. Evidence that the SF26 has more performance than the outside world has seen so far, and that Lewis Hamilton could be the driver who finally discovers how to bring it to light. Now I want to know your opinion. Do you think Hamilton has really found the key to the Ferrari so early in the season? Or do you think it's still too early to draw conclusions about the SF26's real potential? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.